A diversion. That's what a federal judge called Donald Trump's Justice Department's request to unseal the grand jury testimony in the criminal case of Ghislaine Maxwell, in which she was convicted of sex trafficking for and with Jeffrey Epstein, who said he was Donald Trump's closest friend for 10 years. Diversion is what Donald Trump is all about now more than ever. Donald Trump doesn't want the news media attention on his old friend Jeffrey Epstein and what the Epstein files might say about Donald Trump, where we know Donald Trump's name appears multiple times because his attorney general told him that. Donald Trump is sending the National Guard into Washington, D.C. 5 years late. Donald Trump didn't activate any troops on January 6th when his private troops were attacking the Capitol after he told them to go there and fight like hell. And he lied to them when he told them that he was going to go there with them. The biggest crime spree in the history of Washington, D.C. was on January 6th for Donald Trump, and Donald Trump did not send the National Guard that day. But now Donald Trump wants us all to be talking about his decision to send just enough National Guard troops onto the streets of Washington, D.C., so that news cameras can get pictures of them, the same pictures we've seen from Los Angeles, where the troops had absolutely nothing to do and are there for no reason at all, other than as a diversion from Donald Trump's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, which may be described in the Epstein files in a way that Donald Trump wants to keep secret forever. Donald Trump is going to put 200 National Guard troops on the streets of Washington, D.C. That means there will be more hotel doormen on the streets of Washington, D.C. than National Guard troops. There are 3,400 Washington, D.C. police officers in addition to 1,800 Capitol police officers, bringing the total uniformed police officer count in Washington, D.C. to 5,200, without even counting the hundreds of federal uniformed officers working in law enforcement in Washington, D.C., thousands of them actually, as U.S. Marshals, Secret Service agents, FBI agents, and others. And so the 200 National Guard troops who will be on the street are just a photo op. He'll have to send 800 total in order to cover the 8-hour shifts, but only 200 at a time will be on the street, and that will just be for the pictures. A photo op to please Trump voters who apparently want Donald Trump to play these games with troops in cities that elect Democratic mayors. We will surely see this same scene play out in other cities that Donald Trump hates because Democrats live there. The troops' presence will always be tiny compared to the police force already in place, but the TV cameras will magnify the troops' presence, and the endless talk about them online and on cable news and elsewhere will have Donald Trump's intended effect of amusing his supporters and diverting attention from Donald Trump's friendship with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell remains the only child rapist in history who received well wishes from a president of the United States. Donald Trump said, "I wish her well," this was after she was charged with sex trafficking and after she was charged with sexually abusing children. That's when Donald Trump said, "I wish her well." And so Donald Trump's attempts at diversion have become ever more frantic. Donald Trump is using tariffs. He's using Vladimir Putin now. He's using whatever he can think of, whenever he can think of it, to create the kind of diversion that a federal judge found today when he denied the release of the transcripts of the Ghislaine Maxwell grand jury. In his 31-page ruling, the judge revealed what is in the grand jury transcripts. Now we know. The judge described the testimony to the grand jury without quoting any of it, and reduced it all to this statement: there is no there. The judge read the grand jury transcripts and wrote this in his ruling: the court's review confirmed that unsealing the grand jury materials would not reveal new information of any consequence. There's no there. There's no new information in the grand jury transcripts. That's what the judge told us today, and that is what Donald Trump already knew before Donald Trump's attorney general and Donald Trump's deputy attorney general, who used to be Donald Trump's personal criminal defense lawyer, asked to have those meaningless grand jury transcripts unsealed. They knew there was no new information in the secret grand jury transcripts that was not already revealed at the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. They knew that everything in those transcripts came out in public testimony in Ghislaine Maxwell's trial, where Ghislaine Maxwell did not dare testify under oath in her own defense. That's why the judge that Trump, who was asked to unseal the jury transcripts, calls it a diversion. The judge said there's nothing in those transcripts that we don't already know from Maxwell's trial. The judge said that the Trump Justice Department's argument for releasing the grand jury transcripts was, quote, demonstrably false. Demonstrably false. You could spend an entire career in the law prior to the Trump era and never see a federal judge describe the Justice Department's position as demonstrably false. But New York federal judge Paul Engelmeyer, who was appointed by President Barack Obama, said this about the Trump Justice Department's argument. Its entire premise that the Maxwell grand jury materials would bring to light meaningful new information about Epstein's and Maxwell's crimes or the government's investigation into them is demonstrably false. The judge described what happened in the Maxwell grand jury and in the Epstein grand jury, saying, quote, first, the grand juries in this case were not used for investigative purposes. They did not hear testimony from any firsthand witness to any event at issue. They did not hear testimony from any victim, eyewitness, suspect, or even a records custodian. Each grand jury received evidence on a single day. On that day, it heard testimony from one person, a law enforcement agent who, acting as a summary witness, testified to information obtained in the government's investigation to support the charges in the indictment. The agent, responding to tightly structured questions from an assistant United States attorney, provided highly abbreviated hearsay accounts of the statements of select witnesses, the victims on whom the counts in the proposed indictment were based. The agent led the jury through a PowerPoint of exhibits, photographs, and business records. At the end of the testimony, the agent testified that he or she had not disclosed all that he or she knew, but had only responded to the assistant United States attorney's questions. Afterwards, each grand jury voted to return the proposed indictment. The judge revealed that the grand jury transcripts, quote, do not identify any person other than Epstein and Maxwell as having had sexual contact with a minor. They do not discuss or identify any client of Epstein's or Maxwell's. They do not reveal any heretofore unknown means or methods of Epstein's or Maxwell's crimes. They do not reveal new venues at which their crimes occurred. They do not reveal new sources of their wealth. They do not explore the circumstances of Epstein's death. Donald Trump knew all of that before announcing that his attorney general and his former criminal defense lawyer were going to request the release of the grand jury testimony. They knew that there was nothing in that transcript that had not already come out publicly in Ghislaine Maxwell's trial. The judge said it would be reasonable for a member of the public to, quote, conclude that the government's motion for their unsealing was aimed not at transparency, but at diversion, aimed not at full disclosure, but at the illusion of such. And that's exactly what we reported to you on this program on the very night that Donald Trump announced that he was going to ask for the grand jury transcripts to be released. The judge reviewed the Justice Department's public history of statements about the case before the Trump Justice Department asked to release the grand jury transcripts. The judge quoted a public memo released by the Attorney General and the FBI director when they announced that they would not release a single page of the Epstein files and that there was nothing more to investigate. The judge quoted the Trump Justice Department's memo saying, "It is the determination of the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation that no further disclosure would be appropriate or warranted." In that memo, the Trump Justice Department and the Trump FBI said, "We did not uncover evidence that could predicate an investigation against uncharged third parties." So, after Donald Trump's Attorney General and Donald Trump's FBI Director studied the Epstein files, and they put thousands of FBI agents to work studying the Epstein files to find, among other things, every mention of Donald Trump's name, they discovered that the case should just be closed. They discovered that there is no one else who should face any charges and no one else who should even be the subject of any kind of investigation. Quote, "We did not uncover evidence that could predicate an investigation against uncharged third parties." Donald Trump's old friend, Ghislaine Maxwell, was, to her delight, but surely not her surprise, moved from a federal prison in Florida to a minimum security facility in Texas located near her family, which one former federal prison official describes as a country club. That move came just days after Ghislaine Maxwell decided to submit to a meeting and discussion with Donald Trump's former criminal defense lawyer, who now just happens to be the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche. Ghislaine Maxwell never felt safe talking to a federal prosecutor before or a federal agent of any kind, which is why she's never done it before. There's only one federal official in history who Ghislaine Maxwell was willing to talk to, and that's Donald Trump's former criminal defense lawyer, who is a friend of Ghislaine Maxwell's current criminal defense lawyer. Ghislaine Maxwell, no doubt, worried that she could be caught in lies if she ever spoke to a federal prosecutor before Todd Blanche, which is one reason why she never did it and why she never testified in her trial. Ghislaine Maxwell was already charged with perjury before her criminal trial and was not willing to run the risk of adding perjury charges by testifying under oath in her own defense. She didn't say one word in her defense during her sentencing hearing when she did speak in court directly to the judge. What could Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, Donald Trump's former personal criminal defense lawyer, have possibly said to his friend, Ghislaine Maxwell's criminal defense lawyer, to make her so comfortable as to welcome Todd Blanche to come to see her in Florida and talk about her case, or whatever they talked about over those 2 days? Did Ghislaine Maxwell promise Todd Blanche that she would never say an incriminating word about Donald Trump? Did Ghislaine Maxwell make that promise with the hope or understanding that she would be getting out of prison by the last day of the Trump presidency, less than 3.5 years from now? Did Ghislaine Maxwell come out of that meeting with Todd Blanche thinking she only has 3.5 more years in prison instead of the 20 years that she was sentenced to serve? Ghislaine Maxwell's lawyers have lied publicly since that meeting, claiming that she is a scapegoat in the Jeffrey Epstein case. The Maxwell lawyers tell the lie that Ghislaine Maxwell was prosecuted simply because Jeffrey Epstein died in prison and someone had to be prosecuted. In his ruling today, Judge Engelmeyer reminded everyone what Ghislaine Maxwell was charged with: a 6-count indictment against Maxwell alleging that she had facilitated and participated in Epstein's sexual abuse of multiple minor girls. It charged her with conspiracy to entice minors to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, conspiracy to transport minors with intent to engage in illegal sexual activity, 2 counts of perjury. The judge then offered his description of what was proved beyond a reasonable doubt to the jury at Ghislaine Maxwell's trial, and there will be a flood of pardons issued on Donald Trump's last day in office, that's for sure. Most of them will be undeserving. Many of them will be flagrantly scandalous. And some of the most outrageous pardons on that day may be chosen just to take some of the outrage away from a pardon of Ghislaine Maxwell, the pardon she may have earned already in her conversation with Donald Trump's former criminal defense lawyer, Todd Blanche. If the day comes, would Todd Blanche and Donald Trump try to convince Trump followers that Ghislaine Maxwell was just a scapegoat who was unfairly prosecuted? What Judge Paul Engelmeyer wrote about her today should be remembered on that day if Ghislaine Maxwell is ever shown that special mercy that is now within Donald Trump's pardon power the next time he wishes her well. Judge Engelmeyer said that in her trial, it was proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Maxwell had been instrumental in an approximately decade-long scheme with Epstein to entice, groom, transport, and traffic numerous young women and underage girls to engage in sexual activity with Epstein. Maxwell helped identify vulnerable girls for abuse, targeting those who faced difficult family circumstances, including financial hardship, substance use disorders, and prior sexual abuse. Maxwell purported to befriend the girls to gain their trust and create the illusion of friendship and responsible adult supervision while isolating them from others. She then manipulated that trust to normalize sexual abuse by Epstein and herself, often through the pretext of giving Epstein massages. Maxwell personally participated in acts of sexual abuse, including, for example, instructing then 14-year-old Jane how to touch Epstein's penis during a massage and touching Jane's breasts herself. Maxwell and Epstein also paid young girls hundreds of dollars of cash in exchange for meeting Epstein to be sexually abused. Once a girl was introduced to these sexualized massages, she was offered more money if she brought other girls to engage in sexualized massages. Maxwell also fostered a culture of silence at Epstein's various households where sexual abuse occurred, directing employees to see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. Ghislaine Maxwell personally participated in acts of sexual abuse and then told her victims to see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. She was doing that while she and Jeffrey Epstein were friends with Donald Trump. And after she got indicted for that, Donald Trump said, "I wish her well." And now Donald Trump is telling his followers that when it comes to the Epstein files, now it's their turn to see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing.